Hello, this is the second part of my video on the development of Finnish identity up to around 1900, this one dealing with the 18th and 19th centuries. The 18th century saw increasing Swedish cultural influence in Finland, reflecting both government policy, greater economic ties with Sweden, and the development of a more assertive middle class of businessmen and professionals for whom Swedish language skills and even the replacement of Finnish personal names with Swedish ones were seen as means of social advancement. At the same time, influential intellectuals started to assert Finnish distinctiveness and greatness. Two of the most important of these were Daniel Juslenius, a churchman and professor of Hebrew, Greek and theology at the Royal Academy, and Henrik Gabriel Porthan, an influential academic who was later dubbed the father of Finnish history. Juslenius's most lasting contributions were probably his production of the first Finnish language dictionary in 1745, and less tangibly his assertion that there was a common Finnish fatherland to which all Finns were bound by duty. This patriotic call was supported by what would now be seen as fanciful accounts of Finnish greatness and influence on the ancient world, which were later discarded by those who promoted Finnishness, notably by Porthan, who endeavored to establish an evidence-based account of Finnish history, oral tradition, and poetry. Like his contemporary, the great German scholar Johann Gottfried Herder, Porthan saw the folk traditions of the peasantry as the basis for national cultural distinctiveness. Both his historical work and his 5-volume study of Finnish poetry in 1766 to 78 remained major influences on Finnish cultural identity throughout the 19th century. As members of the educated European elite, both Juslenius and Porthan wrote their major works in Latin, but the late 18th century also saw the development of an increasingly diverse range of literature and scholarship published in Finnish. There was also briefly a Finnish language newspaper, and Finnish began to be used by speakers in the Finnish Diet. This trend continued after the Russians formally acquired Finland from Sweden in 1809, treating it thereafter as an autonomous Grand Duchy until almost the end of the century. In addition to an increasing stream of books in Finnish, particularly from the 1820s onwards, there were important scholarly advances, including the publication of a Finnish grammar in 1818 and of the great Finnish national epic, the Kalevala, in 1835. The publication of the Kalevala was a key event in the development of Finnish national consciousness. It was the work of Elias Lönnrot, a country doctor and amateur folklorist. A founder member of the Finnish Literature Society, which was established in 1831, Lönnrot received their support to undertake trips to the remote regions of Karelia and Lapland to collect folk songs, poems, and stories that had been largely forgotten in the more Europeanized parts of the country, publishing a series of books on his researches. Published in its final form in 1849, the Kalevala brought together almost 24,000 verses, compiled and edited by Lönnrot from his informants. It represented an epic view of pre-Christian Finnish folk culture, and is rightly regarded as one of the most important products of the 19th century European folklore movement. Lönnrot also compiled the first Finnish-Swedish dictionary and published a pioneering study of Finnish botany in 1860 in Finnish. Another important scholar was Matthias Castron, a philologist of international repute who travelled widely through the Russian Empire to research the relationship between the various Finno-Ugric languages. He was appointed as the first professor of language and literature at the University of Helsinki in 1851. Other leading pioneers of the academic study of the Finnish language and literature were Julius Krohn and his son Karl Krohn, who developed the historical geographic method for sifting through variant versions of oral traditions to identify the original elements and later accretions. These scholarly developments became interlinked with an emerging stress on the importance of Finnish as a national language. We must remember that at this time Finland was a bilingual country in which Swedish speakers dominated the educated elite, but nevertheless increasingly felt themselves to be Finns by nationality. A parallel situation might be the position of the Anglo-Irish elite in Ireland, who were prominent in the development of Irish nationalism. In establishing Russian rule, successive Tsars agreed to preserve the traditional rights of Finland, including the use of Swedish as the official language of administration within the Grand Duchy. At that time, only around 15% of the Finnish population were native Swedish speakers, but many native Finnish speakers, the remaining 85%, understood enough Swedish to deal with the Swedish language bureaucracy, and those Finnish speakers who furthered their education beyond primary level also became fluent in Swedish as well as Latin. At the same time, many Swedish speakers whose professions brought them into regular contact with the common people learned Finnish as a second language. Language reflected class divisions, in that Swedish remained the predominant language of the social elite, but the relationship between language and social class was inexact, and there was as yet no clear divide between the two language communities, with many people who were comfortably bilingual. This began to change with the growth of Finnish nationalism. For a growing number of Finns of both language communities, the replacement of Russian for Swedish rule raised questions of identity. They were clearly not Russians, being separated from them by language, religion, and culture, but now that the political links with Sweden had been cut, they were no longer part of any greater Sweden. This double separation was clearly realized by the Swedish-speaking writer, political activist, and historian Adolf Ivar Arvidsson, who became the pioneer of Finnish nationalism, roughly from the 1820s onwards, and spent much of his adult life in exile in Sweden. There was also the principle, propounded both by Herder and Finland's own Porthan, that language and the traditions of the common people were the basis for national identity. As such, a Finnish nationalism seemed to require the elevation of the Finnish language. Many of the early Finnish nationalists were actually Swedish speakers, including the majority of the people I have mentioned so far. Even what became the Finnish national anthem, first performed in 1848, was originally written in Swedish. These nationalists became Fennomans, who promoted Finnishness in opposition to the Svenkamans, who wanted to preserve Swedish links, and in some cases even promoted the idea of Swedish racial superiority over the Finns. The language of folklorists and scholars revealed the Finns' rich cultural heritage, and gave the language of the masses literary form, and it was readily seized upon as a source of national feeling, most notably with the publication of the Kalevala, which became the inspiration for a growing body of national art, music, and poetry. For nationalistic Swedish-speaking Finns, such as academic and historian George Zacharias Forsman, Finnishness increasingly required a cultural shift, he himself changing his name to Finnish as Rojo Sakari Rojo Koskinen. The Russian government did not play a major role in these developments, but seems to have welcomed the development of a Finnish identity insofar as it weakened any lingering attachment that Finns might have with Sweden. The Russians came to accept the use of Finnish in their administration, and expected government officials to know it, but the work of further promoting the Finnish language was performed by the Finns themselves, notably the politician and educator Johan Wilhelm Snellman, himself a Swedish speaker, and later by Rojo Koskinen. Snellman was a strong supporter of the reformist Russian Tsar Alexander II, who reigned from 1855 to 1881, and who gave Finnish an official status for some purposes in 1863. Snellman also served as de facto finance minister for the Grand Duchy during the 1860s, played a major role in convincing the Russians to convene the Finnish Diet in 1863 after a break of over 50 years, and worked for several decades to increase the access to post-primary education for native Finnish speakers. The process of increasing educational access continued after Snellman's death, and by 1900 almost two-thirds of grammar schools used Finnish as their medium of instruction, up from less than one-third in the 1880s, whilst 56% of university entrants were registered as native Finnish speakers, up from only 8% in 1870. Also important in the growing public use of the Finnish language were the rising number of newspapers published in Finnish. Between 1890 and 1905, some 80 Finnish-language papers were published in Finland, compared to only 50 in Swedish. The majority of these publications were produced in the provinces, indicating a wide market for news and opinion. Thank you for listening. Please note that I've also produced 2 videos on the period of Russian rule of Finland, which may be of interest.